Today we're having a conversation with Sara Moslener about evangelical purity culture. Check this out. This is TenOnReligion. Hey peeps, it's Dr. B with TenOnReligion. If you like religion and philosophy content, one thing I really need you to do is to smash that sub button because it really helps out the channel. You can also give me a super thanks here on the YouTube machine. New episodes are posted about every 2 weeks at noon, U.S. Pacific time, so drop me some views. Sara Moslener wrote an interesting book titled Virgin Nation, Sexual Purity and American Adolescence. Her research area is evangelical purity culture, and if you don't know what that is, here's our conversation. Hello, we are here with Sara Moslener from Central Michigan. How are you doing today, Sara?
I'm doing all right. It's been a rough 2-3 weeks. Lots to process, lots to think about, lots of concern, especially for what's going on in Southern California with the fires and all of you who live there, and just the devastation of it, and then this is a hard semester to teach, and I teach about religious discrimination and racism in the U.S., and so it's a little overwhelming right now.
Yeah, it's we're going to be talking about evangelical purity culture here for a while, and just to let everybody know, I have a sort of a bandage here. I just whacked myself on my head when I was trying to plug something into my computer a few minutes ago, but we're rolling with it anyway. So the reason why I have Sara, that I asked her to have a discussion with us today, because she wrote a very fascinating book a while ago called Virgin Nation, Sexual Purity and American Adolescence, and it's more of a descriptive book on the history of this movement. And so we want to talk about this for a little while here. For those that don't know, the purity movement was kind of a 1990s development, although maybe a little bit in the 80s as well, largely in evangelical churches in the United States. So you did a whole history behind this in this book leading up to that time period. So tell us a little bit more about this movement. What are some of the causes or contributing factors to its emergence? And I guess basically what I'm asking is, if purity culture was the answer to something, then what was the question or what was the problem that it was addressing?
Right. Yeah. So yes, as you said, I am trained as a U.S. religious historian, and so for me, the answer goes all the way back to the 19th century,
Wow.
and ideologies about white womanhood, and um, and there were several, but one of them was purity, sexual purity, and of course they didn't in the Victorians didn't say the word sexual; they said social
Oh,
purity, and yes, but this in this time period, it became a trait associated with white womanhood, um, that had that did a variety of things. One, by the way, if you see a tail behind me, that is my dog Gibson, who's trying to snuggle in right now for a nap. Um, but but white womanhood became kind of this national symbol of sexual purity, one that is going to have significant implications for how we continue to think about race in the United States. And what was really mind boggling to me when I started, because I started out looking at the evangelical movements, what I called, when I wrote my dissertation and even in my book, I think I called them faith-based abstinence movements, because
okay.
this was before the term evangelical purity culture was coined,
Right.
and that's the one that has very much caught on, and so it's you know to see it sort of grow has been really kind of wild. But yeah, so the problems in the 80s and 90s, right? There were sort of multiple sex panics happening, as sociologists would call them. A lot of anxiety about teen sex, and looking at the rates of teen pregnancies that appeared to be on the rise. In fact, they were.
And what time frame was this?
So this would have been the late 80s, early 90s.
Okay, 1980s, 1990s. Okay.
Yep, yeah. So, and in fact, the it was the rise of teen pregnancies among white people, and that caused alarm, which is interesting to think about. The rise wasn't among people of color; it was among white people, and there were um, observers and pundits who sort of noted that as well. This is a sign of our decline, kind of thing. So that was the first, right? So teen pregnancy, but also HIV/AIDS.
Mhm.
And right, so you have these two kind of sex panics, that really detracted from actually dealing with the issues at hand. Uh, and um, and in fact, it was so when one of the main groups that I study from the Southern Baptist Convention, True Love Waits, when they first got started, it was uh, my youth minister in Tennessee and the youth of his church, and they had a conversation about all the LGBT folks who were coming out, and sort of the status that gave them. And their youth pastor, who founded True Love Wade, said, "Well, why don't you come out?" And so that's what they did. So it was very much formed around um, the the gay rights movement, and which is and something that evangelical Christians do is they will co-opt the language, if not the behavior of minoritized groups in order to claim themselves as a minority, and it's really, yeah. And so to sort of see the way that this is, rooted very much in homophobia and also racism, um, from the very beginning, I think is really important to understand. But what is mind-boggling is that none of these groups really knew what had happened in the 19th century, where they were doing similar things with a different kind of focus, even having people recite and sign pledges, as was a big part of
Mhm.
evangelical purity culture. And so that's so yeah, so that's one. There are many different ways to frame it historically, but that's probably where I would start.
So what are some of the negative effects this movement has caused? I mean, are there these
Mhm.
like intended or unintended consequences? Are we still seeing the influence today?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we can certainly talk about the more systemic, right? Because of purity culture, we got abstinence only education, and which has become a an impediment to teaching real education, and so that is a battle that continues to be fought in school districts, and so we have so there's that level of it, but there's also the individual level. For my current project, I started by interviewing people who grew up and out of purity culture, most of whom I would say it reached its height in in our moment in our lifetime in the early 2000s. And so most of the people I interviewed were teenagers at that time, and I interviewed them, and every story was one of different kinds of struggle. Like there is a spectrum of harm. Even people I interviewed who said, for me, this was okay. But I saw what it did to my friends, so even for people who got out unscathed, it was, um, uh, they were very aware. But um, a lot of anxiety around sexuality, around spirituality. Certainly, no place for anyone who is queer, right? So, um, and so, no support there. So for people, I interviewed someone who said, I was out to myself when I was 12, and I knew I just had to keep it to myself until I graduated high school and could leave. So that kind of stuff. Also, um, along with it, the kind of, seeing elements of spiritual abuse, right? Because this is a way of connecting sexuality with spirituality in a way that says, if you don't do this, right, your relationship with God is going to be destroyed. There's going to be no hope for a good, marriage relationship. And so I talked to so many people, um, and I should say overwhelmingly women, white women, um, who were taught to not have a sense of embodiment, that even being taught that sex was not something that they would ever enjoy.
Yeah, it
And
seems like there's a lot of, I mean, just listening to you here for the last few minutes, there's a lot of power and control issues going on, a lot of objectification.
yeah,
Um, I mean, and I'm not sure if that was all, again, intended or unintended, but it's clearly
yeah, yeah,
one of the ramifications of this.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's hard to know. I mean, I think the people who endorse it very much believe that it is good. But of course, it is, um, very much about controlling women's bodies, is what I see overwhelmingly. And although I've talked to some men who say, like, yes, for women it was about their bodies, but for men it was about controlling their minds and their thoughts. And so the kind of, struggles that young men would have, because the foundation of purity teachings is that boys are naturally sexually aggressive and girls are naturally sexually passive.
So
And so,
that's a very stereotypical view. Okay.
exactly, right? These are gender stereotypes and that are deeply harmful, because when you internalize them, what you're doing is you're making monsters out of all boys. And so, I mean, imagine then being a boy who's internalized this, and then you start having normal sexual urges and thoughts and everything, and you learn to hate those things about yourself. And then with women and girls, it's much more about your body and, being responsible for your body and how it dresses, particularly so that you're not causing men and boys to stumble, right? So, and there is research now, that directly that identifies this and directly connects it to what we call rape culture, right? The normalization of these gender roles normalizes rape and says, well, this is how women and girls are, this is how men and boys are, and that's, you know you, it's a rape scenario, as opposed to people feeling a sense of having sexual literacy and also having, a sense of embodiment. And all this is the starting point is that sex is bad, that sex is something that threatens your relationship to God and will, harm you in any number of ways. And and so it was a very powerful message, because it's certainly not new, but it was coupled with this idea of this is how you be a faithful Christian. And this is, It was very effective.
Yeah, I was going to ask you how men have been negatively affected by this move, but you just
Mhm.
already answered that question.
Yeah.
So, um, let me ask you this. So, one of the principles that you and others in what you call post purity culture
Hmm.
have advocated for is the idea that to effectively dismantle the purity culture, there must be this focus on embodied healing. So,
Hmm.
tell us a little bit more about what that means, because that seems a little unclear for some people.
Sure. So in my interviews, the overwhelming theme I heard from women was of disembodiment, of women who really didn't understand their bodies until they gave birth.
Wow.
Yeah. And so, so all of these teachings that like, your sexual pleasure is non-existent, it doesn't matter, and just being completely cut off from the possibilities of sexual pleasure, and that's right, that's part of who we are as human beings, um, and the way and sort of, you know coming to realize that, is yeah, it's it's one thing. So people who will make the realization, and say, yeah, this is not good, I don't agree with this anymore, I don't want to, I want to make different choices, um find that even if they can intellectually say that, their bodies are still very much shaped, by, um, you know, by these restrictions around, so it is right. These are embodied lessons. You can't think your way out of them. And so, and so there are a lot of people sort of in the post purity world who work as embodiment coaches and trying to help people kind of reconnect. And this is, in white evangelicalism, in particular, right, there is a real, um, embrace of the idea that our bodies are suspect. And of course, this is in many ways, right? This is traditional, um, Christian theology, and this idea that going all the way back to the Greeks, that matter is evil, the spirit is good, and so they really kind of, revived that in a way that gave it a renewed sacred significance. And so, the idea of being able to abstain, being able to control your appetites. I think about the desert fathers and mothers, and the early Christians who associated like eating meat with something that was, you shouldn't
Yeah.
do that because it will arouse the passions, right? So, right, so this really strict asceticism that you see pieces of, in the Christian historical tradition and theological traditions, um, but what that looks like in the lives of teenage girls, um, is, increased eating disorders.
Yeah.
That, this idea that, hey, if I control these desires, right, and eating disorders, and I interviewed, a couple people about this, and there is someone who has written a dissertation, on the topic, and has published on it. Her name is, she is now Dr. Rebecca Wolf, so check out her work. But what I learned from her and also other people I interviewed is that, eating disorders are a way to practice disembodiment, and a way to feel pious, in the same way that practicing abstinence from sex helps you feel pious. So there was, and if you, depending on your body type, if you, your body becomes less, right, and you lose sort of, feminine features and this sort of thing. And so the connection between, the the expectations of sexual purity and of eating disorders really goes hand in hand. And again, it's all about making sure the body is under control, and so that and so that right, so that is sort of one of the more extreme examples of what I mean by disembodiment.
Wow. So
Mm-hmm.
let's flip the script for a second. So
Mm-hmm.
if purity culture is the problem, like if it's not an
Mm-hmm.
appropriate way to
Yeah.
understand and socialize people about sexual health and all of its aspects,
Mm-hmm.
like physically, socially, emotionally, etc.,
Mm-hmm.
then how should we be teaching, kids and parents? I mean, what does a uh,
Yeah.
healthier or more appropriate model look like?
Yeah, what I always recommend, I think, and this is in fact a faith-based sex education, one of the best I think that we have in this country, comes from the Unitarian Universalists. It's called Our Whole Lives,
Okay.
OWL. If you have a UU church in your area, they may provide trainings, and I believe it's open to everyone. They're not sort of this members only kind of group, but it is right. It's holistic, it's comprehensive, and is very much kind of doing the kinds of things that we need in sex education to give young people a sense of who they are in their bodies, and um, and to and to be able to know, differences between sort of good touch and bad touch, right? When you're talking to younger people, but also like, consensual practices versus
Yeah.
non-consensual. This is something that purity culture really gets wrong because they label any sex before marriage as a problem, as a sin, as dangerous, as something that's going to impact your mental health, possibly your physical health and everything. And so in that, there's no distinction between consensual and non-consensual sex. And that to me is really troubling. And so you know, uh, a good sex ed plan program needs to prioritize consent, needs to prioritize our relationships to our bodies as things that are good, and and not things that we need to be afraid of.
So this is kind of part of a larger discussion of just about religion and sexual abuse in general.
Mm,
But even though this is more of a subset of that, I mean, healing from the effects of purity culture
yeah.
for some people might seem like kind of like a niche thing to recover from. So
Mm.
for people who might be listening to this that feel like they need more information or help, what types of resources are available that you can point us to?
Yeah, yeah. Well, since you mentioned sexual abuse, right? This was when I first started studying this, this was my dissertation topic. So I started this in 2006. And for many years, the idea of connecting this to sexual abuse was never on my radar. Years later, I met and have been working with a survivor advocate, and she said when she first read my book, her thought was the next thing she's going to be studying is sexual abuse,
Hmm.
and so we now have evidence of the connections, and especially of the way that religious communities respond to to survivors. That it is very much rooted in all these myths about rape, and so that is right. The survivors' experience in church communities is one that isn't is first about the initial experience, but then about what happens um, when the community just sort of closes ranks and protects leadership, and protects and we see this over and over again. But back to your question, yes, there are many sources. If anyone is listening who or watching who has experienced um, sexual abuse in a church environment. There is a wonderful organization. There are many wonderful organizations. The one I work closely with is called Into Account. You can find them. They have been doing really incredible work. This stuff gets litigious really fast, and that's another hurdle that survivors have to deal with, and it's just a whole set of experiences that re-traumatize the survivor. And so a group like Into Account, like, they know how to do the work. They will do all your homework for you. And or Another thing I have found um, is that if people experience trauma really scrambles your brain and your memory. And what happens to many survivors is they immediately participate in self-blame. And so part of the healing work that needs to happen is for survivors to be able to tell their own stories, and to tell the story of what happened to them in a way that's true. Meaning that it's not about, oh, this is what I did, this is what I was wrong, but is able to say, this is what happened to me, this is who's responsible. And that takes so much work to do. And so another recommendation I have um, is, to find, if you are a writer, to find writing groups that you can work with. Um, and and work on writing your story, right? But not you don't have to share it with other people. You just need to be able to tell it to yourself in a way that's true.
Yeah, and when you get it down,
Exactly.
I guess when you put it something like physically like that, when you actually are writing
Right.
something, then to some extent it's out of you, it's expressed. It almost seems like it's more real at that point.
Yeah, exactly. And you're creating a narrative. um right, you're taking everything that's scrambled in your brain. And the thing is, a lot of people can't do it. And we know, like, in some cases people don't know 20, 30, 40 years later that that was the experience they had. And because they don't name it, right? They were 15 years old and in a relationship with a youth minister. This is Krista Brown's story. And she was convinced that she was having an affair at 15 with an adult church worker. And it wasn't until her own daughter was 16 that it occurred to her, wait, that was not an affair. That, right? So the language, right, the gaslighting that happens, where survivors don't have even the language to explain to themselves what happened. um yeah, so Linda K. Klein, if people have not read Linda's book, I think one of the most important on uh, in the post purity genre of books. And she also will work with clients who are working on sort of recovery kinds of stuff. She herself has her own story of um, and takes a deep dive into PTSD, people who experience PTSD around sex, even talking about sex. I interviewed someone who said, I couldn't talk about sex without breaking out into hives, right? So people
Wow,
having these very
wow.
visceral responses and their bodies being so traumatized that their bodies are going into self-protection mode. And so yeah, so there's a lot of uh, so that there are a lot of different ways that you can find, and everyone finds uh, different ways to sort of reconnect to their body. um, and and I know, for me it was, of course, I realize now one of the reasons I really liked school was because my head is my safe place, and just being able to think about things. And so this has really kind of shifted the way I think about doing my scholarship, about talking about what I research, and even teaching that we are so trained to not be in our bodies, and the number of harms that really promotes. Um,
Yeah. So let's get into your teaching for a few
mhm,
minutes because I'm interested in how these ideas get integrated into a classroom setting. You teach courses on religion, race, and discrimination, religion and sexuality, and others.
mhm,
And for those of you that are not professional educators, college education is about like content delivery, classroom activities, assessment.
mhm.
That's kind of oversimplifying it a little bit, but let's leave aside the assessment piece for now. But what types of things do you do to help students sort of understand and appropriate these issues? I mean, are there things that you've discovered that works best? How do the students respond to all of this?
Yeah. So to just tell you a little bit more about my context, Central Michigan University is, one of
Yeah,
the directional Michigans. So it's large, but not as large as our, flagship schools here in Michigan.
and a public
And a
setting.
public university,
Yeah.
yeah. So I haven't taught religion and sexuality for quite some time. My job became um, teaching religion, race, and discrimination because it's a
Okay.
general education course, and so
Sure.
it fulfills a requirement about studying the history of racism in the United States, and so it's a very so yeah, and I teach 160 students a semester in four different sections, right? So there's lots of challenges, both institutional and just content wise. But I taught for a while courses in our uh, Center for Intergroup Dialogue, and so I've developed some of those practices to get students to think about having difficult conversations, and so that's what I have. I now teach my course as a like we're learning to have difficult conversations about very hard topics. Our topics are religious discrimination and racism, and so this is how I'm able to kind of get students on board in terms of um, doing things a little differently and getting them to think about how they are showing up to these conversations. So my thing this semester is what's your vibe, before you get into a discussion about a heavy topic, check in with yourself, right? What is your body telling you? Are you feeling anxious? Are you feeling tired, right? And so getting students to really um, kind of be able to check in with themselves. And again, right, our educational systems encourage students to only go in head first. And because ultimately, and this is the argument I make in my book, both when it comes to purity culture and when it comes to race, like disembodiment is seen as a virtue, right? Color blindness says like, oh, I don't see race, and that's still the predominant form of racism in the United States, is people claiming that you know they don't see race, they don't think about it, and of course that doesn't do any good. And so getting people to think about who they are in the world, how they are perceived, thinking about their social identities. We just did this last week. What does it, um, getting my students to think about being at a predominantly white institution. What does that mean? And so one of the topics I teach about and have been for quite some time is white racial identity, which is the racial identity that is completely disembodied, that it's the one we can't talk about. And so that's how I bring in kind of this the embodiment piece to my classes, is really trying to get students to um, be in the classroom as whole people, not just a brain. um, and to start, engaging one another in that way.
Yeah, that's interesting. And often when I taught in Atlanta at a community college for about 7 years, and
Mhm.
during that time I had students from more than 100 different countries, and so I would
Whoa.
have this is a very ethnically and culturally diverse area, and
Yeah.
I'd always ask students, what languages that they spoke,
Hmm.
and I think that they appreciated that, because then
Right.
uh, we we identified their countries or cultures of origin, and we
Yeah.
celebrated them, and we respected them, and had some conversations about it, and so on and so forth. And
Hmm.
it was I think it helped people open up in the classroom to each other,
Yeah.
and to some extent
Absolutely.
maybe to me as the instructor as well. And so the whole idea of identifying and connecting with
Yeah. Yeah.
our identity and who we are, but again, with these sorts of issues, it goes a lot deeper than what language you speak.
Right. Right. But that's really, I think that's really great. And being able to help people feel like they feel known in the classroom and seen. I think that is really, really important. And but yeah, I love that. And when you can get students, when I hear students talking openly about sort of their unique experiences, that's because I've been teaching this long enough to know, like, what the party lines are, like
Yeah.
you hear the same things over and over again. But when a student really talks about experiences of who they are, that's when I know I've created the right kind of learning environment. And yeah, it's just, yeah, man, there's so many challenges to teaching these days. And yeah, I mean, the pandemic was hard,
Yeah.
you know, and in making changes. But now I feel like we're like, okay, well, where do we go? Do we completely change back? Like, that doesn't seem right. Like, how do we, and how do we kind of get out of I feel like there's sort of a rote expectation, increased rote expectations for being students anymore. Yeah.
Yeah, I to sort of wrap things up. I mean, let me just sort of give you one more last statement. But I mean, it seems like this whole discussion is centered around this idea of, what does it mean to be human and the human experience? Um,
Yeah.
what does it mean to be human, and who gets to decide, and how are
Mhm.
those decisions made?
Exactly.
Is that how would you respond
Absolutely.
to that?
I think that's absolutely right. And of course, right now, that question is being asked around issues of citizenship.
Hmm.
And it's not, and the thing is, when we talk about citizenship, we talk about it in a way that is about, like, are people human beings or not?
Yeah.
And the same with the anti-trans stuff. It's really, yeah, it's disorienting, and it's destabilizing, and those mean the same thing. But yeah, I mean, the dehumanization that's happening right now. And yes, right. And so there are groups that are being targeted, who, are really afraid right now. But it dehumanizes all of us. And I think that's our real work right now, is how do we stay connected to our humanity?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, because I mean, as soon as we turn people into objects or people into things, we
Yeah.
can label them, we can victimize them, we can say they're the reason that you're having problems. I mean, all this sort of nonsense.
Yep.
And so that when we're like halfway through our talk, where I say, sort of what's the more appropriate model? So the re-embodiment and the rehumanizing is really kind of the answer.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that means, and that can mean all sorts of things.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm at the point of, at least in teaching, I've been in my current job. This is my 11th year, so of just really wanting to radicalize the classroom, I think. and in ways that I never had confidence to do before, right? Because we are trained in our graduate programs, and our students are trained that, like, if you're a professor, right, you're the most important thing in the classroom, right? Your knowledge is the most important thing in the classroom. And that's simply not true. It's the
Yeah.
learning that's the most important thing in the classroom. And so, and that's how, and that's how students are trained too. So that's what they want. They want the brain on the podium and, tell me what I need to know to get a good grade. And so this is all, what our educational system is and what we're fighting against. And so to sort of re-embody that is really pushing against a lot of ingrained habits. But that's, yeah, but at least I feel like that's the work that I'm supposed to be doing right now. And unfortunately, people have been writing about it and doing it for a very, very long time. And so it's not like I have to reinvent anything, but it's still work. It's a lot of work.
All right. And I now you sent me a few links, which I'll put down in the
Yes,
description below, and maybe a few other things we talked about. I'll try to look up, or you can send me later, so I can put it in the description in case people want to
absolutely.
reference things or look them up. So I appreciate this conversation.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sarah, so much for being with here and talking with us today.
Yeah, thanks for branching out from your usual
Yeah,
PRT topics. It
yeah, sounds good.
was great to
All right,
talk to you.
thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So, what did you think about our convo? Leave a comment below and let me know what you think. Coming up next is a great episode on Feuerbach revolving around the question, did we create God? We're also going to have some more great interviews with religion scholars doing some fantastic work. Until next time, stay curious. If you enjoyed this, support the channel in the link below. Give me a super thanks. Also, please like and share this video and subscribe to this channel. This is TenOnReligion.